try not to read this, but I've sort of put together my story about how I first found out that I had a hearing problem, and also how I've dealt with it over the years. So half a lifetime ago, when I was newly married, I was having a fight with my husband, who was trying to have a conversation with me standing in another room. He shouts at me, "Go and get your hearing checked." And I shouted back, "There's nothing wrong with my hearing," and stormed out. Anyhow, I decided to prove him wrong. I really was adamant that I was going to prove him wrong. So I went to my GP and I got a referral to see a hearing specialist. The actual appointment was preceded by a hearing test, and after it, the audiologist sat me down carefully and gently and told me that my hearing was a little bit out of the normal range, that I had mild hearing loss. Suddenly, so many things made sense to me. In primary school, I'd been very aware of being slow to pick up reading. As a teenager, everybody else knew the words of the songs. How come I didn't? And in my 20s, when friends started having children, I'd be over at someone's place and the mother'd get up suddenly, "Oh, the baby's awake." I never heard the baby. I actually thought there was a thing called mother's instinct from one room to another. So all these things came to mind, and it was like, oh, yeah, okay, I have some hearing loss. I then had a discussion with the specialist who explained some things and sent me home with a brochure. I sat with my husband, we went through things, and that was the very beginning of my journey. Also spoke with my parents, who were both totally surprised. They had absolutely no idea. But Mum said to me that I'd always been a quiet child. So a few years ago, I actually was going through my parents' papers and I found a letter from my primary school principal when I was 10 years old recommending I have a hearing test. So that obviously was never followed up, but it's just interesting that there'd been some sort of indicators at that level, at that age. Anyhow, a couple of years after my first test, I went for a follow-up, and it was found that my hearing had declined a little bit further. As I'd had a baby in the interim, the specialist decided to send me for a test to see if my hearing loss was inner ear or middle ear. And some of you may know there's a middle ear condition that can be triggered during pregnancy. Anyhow, my loss is inner ear, so that didn't make any difference. Also, just as an aside, having a little child and knowing that mother's instinct didn't really exist, I, of course, made sure I had a baby monitor. And other people may have experienced this, but the funniest thing is waking up at night and having your husband snore on one side and the baby monitor. So just something in my story. Anyhow, a few years after that, and every test, I had gradual more hearing decline. I was now divorced and I was juggling work and single parenting. And I was eventually referred for audiology to the Hear Service, which was part of VicDef, which is now Expression Australia and Expression Audiology. A few more years, and it was recommended that I would benefit from hearing aids, but it still took me 2 years to admit I really needed them. So that's not an unusual story. And then once I decided that, it took some months to organise my own budget so I could afford them. So in my mid-40s, on 1st of May 2002, I acquired my first set of hearing aids. So I've just had my 19th anniversary. Of course, at the time, they had to be the invisible ones, the inner ear ones. And I clearly remember walking out of the audiologist's rooms and hearing the whoosh of the cars going past. It was just... I'll never forget it. And going to the supermarket, discovering there was background music. And, these are things from my first day with hearing aids. As an aside, as a person in my mid-40s, then getting the smaller inner ear hearing aids is one thing, but I personally would never recommend them, especially for older people. They're too difficult to handle and most expensive to maintain with batteries. it took me a couple of years to be comfortable to publicly admit I was wearing hearing aids. But really, at any age, we should never be ashamed and stigmatised for wearing hearing aids. I also think we need to campaign that people shouldn't be self-conscious about the hearing aids, and hiding hearing aids should not be a sales feature, as they often are. Anyhow, in my first years with hearing aids, nobody told me that they didn't make my hearing normal. So I went around presuming I was hearing everything exactly the same as someone in the normal range. And it's only in recent years I also found out that my early pattern was genetic. Nobody told me that at the time. And these are things that the audiologist or the specialist should have told me first up. And I feel that some of the impact on my life would have been different if I'd been told these things right at the beginning. Professionally, my working life has been in public relations and communications, and I was working in mainstream, but also had a specialisation in multicultural communications. And eventually I realised that my continuing gradual hearing loss was having a significant impact on me having stable employment. I mean, who wants to hire a communication practitioner with hearing loss? And I've got lots of little things that I look back on once it's sort of penny dropped that either was impacted by my hearing loss or perhaps prejudice of bosses or supervisors about my hearing loss. So, you know, jobs became patchy. I'd be doing a high-level project and then have periods of unemployment. And one day, thinking it through, I decided to make my hearing loss a positive and came up with a concept that I branded inclusive communications, which is the idea of the theory of taking to professional PR and communications to reach audiences that aren't mainstream in the way that they receive information. So that's people like ourselves who have a communications disability. It's people with low English literacy from other cultures, and in recent years, issues like digital literacy, and even most recently, things like trusting your news sources are sorts of areas that I put in all together under inclusion. Personally, though, as an individual, I bit off too much for one person to develop a new field of work, market the idea, obtain work, and then deliver it. So while the concept is excellent, as a stable source of income, it unfortunately didn't take off for me. Now, a few more years down the track, my hearing has drifted into the severe category, and I'm on my fourth set of hearing aids, and I'm really happy for NDIS that I drifted into that, because I've been able to get a few extra supports and things which I couldn't afford otherwise. But it's been very obvious to me that the depth of how my hearing loss has affected my life way beyond employment and financial. It's had major impact on my health and significant challenge on my social confidence, connections with people, and life in general. I continue to work championing inclusion in communications, and I now combine this with health consumer advocacy, which is something I stumbled into about 5 years ago. And that's definitely another story, not for tonight. So I think I've probably said enough. I'm happy to answer questions later. Thank you for listening.